Okay, hello everyone. I'm Quintus, I'm from Flashbot's research. And today I'll be talking about a topic that sort of steps outside the scope of the things we usually talk about at these kinds of events. And I hope this is an expansion of scope that will be lasting, and we'll see more of this in events to come. And I'll be talking about the sort of the idea of trust and the idea of trust in hardware, hence the sort of confusing name. Now, before I start, just to set the ground, a TTEE at a high level is a piece of hardware that gives you some security guarantees against an adversary and can convince a remote user that a program is protected in its privacy and its integrity, even when that user doesn't have access to the machine. Now, TTEEs have seen a lot of uptake recently. You can see many examples. WhatsApp is an end-to-end encrypted messaging service, which now sends user data to a TTE-secured LLM, optionally. Apple has launched a private cloud compute service to run AI workloads on user data that used to be kept only locally on their devices. Organizations like Flashbots are pushing for TTEs to be used in blockchain block building. On some days, close to 50% of Ethereum blocks are being built in TTEs. Signal uses TTEs for contact discovery. There are many more examples that I could go through, but the basic point is that there's a big trend. And the problem with this trend is that TTEs are full of holes, as they are today. The adversarial model doesn't consider the supply chain. It doesn't consider physical attacks. And so we're left in a position where actors like Intel and AWS are able to completely circumvent our security mechanisms. We're also left in a position where, because security is based on reputation, there are only a couple of big, reputable actors that we can interact with instead of having a very diverse ecosystem. And I think the first step to addressing this problem is breaking away from a kind of abstraction that we have. We tend to treat hardware sort of falling from the sky, and then we just accept it. We either use it or we don't. It's either secure or we don't. But in reality, it's this kind of almost beautiful object, which is very complex, but it's also engineered. There are many trade-offs, and it can be designed for different use cases if you can articulate those well and make the case. So I guess part of this message is that I think we should design towards an ideal, and this ideal is the trustless TTE. And what is that? Well, I think I just mentioned that physical security is a big problem, and really what we're interested in is verifiable physical security, meaning that not only should the hardware protect us against adversaries who have physical access, it should do so in a way that we can be convinced that it actually does it, meaning it's open source so we can verify that what security mechanisms are in place, what code is actually running. And in order to do this, we need verifiable remote attestation, meaning that a remote user can be convinced within an interesting security model, not just trusting a central party, that they are indeed interacting with a piece of hardware that satisfies a certain design. So to elaborate on this, okay. So do you guys want to hear a joke? I was speaking to my plastic surgeon the other day. His name is Philip. Good. Hello, everyone. I am Quintus from Flashbot's research, and today I will be expanding the scope of the things we usually talk about at events like today, and I hope that this expansion will be lasting. As you can see, I'll be tackling the idea of trust in hardware. And before I start, I should explain like a basic definition for those who don't know. A TTE, a trusted execution environment, is a piece of hardware that gives us some assurances that code is being run in a confidential way with integrity against some adversarial model, and can convince even a remote user that this is the case, so the remote user can open a secure channel with the TTE. In recent months, we have seen an incredible uptake of TEEs, partly due to the advent of AI, partly for other reasons. WhatsApp, an end-to-end encrypted messenger, is now sending user data optionally to an AI-based or TEE-based AI inference tool. Apple has launched a TEE-based private cloud to move data and computations that used to be local to the cloud. Organizations like Flashbots are trying to, or advocating for and developing TEE solutions for blockchain block building. On some days, up to 50% of Ethereum blocks these days are being built in TEEs. Signal uses TEE for contact discovery, the list goes on and on. And the basic point is that TEEs seem to be growing and growing in importance, and part of the reason for this is that they're just much easier to use and much more performant than anything else we have to offer. Now, the problem with this is that there are many holes in the security models. For one, the sort of supply chain and manufacturer is a trusted actor in the TEE security model, and TEEs also don't protect against physical actors. This means, one, that we are vulnerable to actors like Intel and AWS should they decide not to have our interests at heart, but also we have to interact with actors who have a strong reputation because security is based more so on trust than on actual technical enforcement. I think the first step to changing this, to plugging these holes, is to break away from a kind of simplifying assumption and mental model that we always have, I think, in this community. And that's that the sort of hardware falls from the sky, that it is something we take and it's either secure or it's not secure, where in reality, it's a very complex object. And I think sort of in this, at least in this case, you can see it's quite a beautiful object, which is designed with trade-offs in mind and can serve different kinds of use cases and has an active body of research going into it for security and performance. And really, I think we should try to influence this to our needs. So what I'm going to advocate for today is that we should try to strive for a kind of ideal from the hardware space. And I'm calling this a trustless TEE, which obviously is an impossible thing. There's no such thing as trustlessness. But it's an ideal that I think we should strive for. And what I mean by this is that, like I just said, we're missing physical security in these devices. And I think we should strive for verifiable physical security. So not only should the hardware protect against physical attackers, the design should be open and auditable. The code should be open and audible so that we can tell whether these countermeasures meet our bar. Secondly, we should have verifiable remote attestation so that users who do not have access to the physical device can be, without simply trusting a central authority, convinced that they are actually interacting with a piece of hardware that satisfies the advertised design. So what do I mean by remote attestation? I can sort of give a slightly more detailed abstraction to talk through it. So imagine we have an adversary that presents us a piece of hardware, and they have an interaction with an inspection body, a certificate authority that has a look at the hardware. This certificate authority can then issue a attestation, a certificate to a user telling them, hey, we think this piece of hardware does satisfy the blueprint. And with that, the user should be, with some confidence, able to interact with the hardware knowing what its design is. Obviously, this doesn't make any sense if the hardware doesn't actually have interesting security properties, which brings us to another kind of abstraction I want to give. So when we think about physical adversaries, we have to think about various attacks we don't always have to think about in software security. One is physical side channels like power channels and electromagnetic radiation. Another is fault injection. The adversary can influence the execution of programs on the chip, and finally, there's adversaries can literally drill into the hardware, shave away at it, and we have to think about these things. And we have two kinds of goals that we could strive for with physical security. The first and easier of the two is integrity, meaning that a program only returns a value if it's correct or doesn't return anything at all. The more challenging property, but also the more interesting, is confidentiality, which broadly means that the program does doesn't leak. But I think we can be a bit more specific. And one thing we can target is if the adversary only learns a sequence of instructions that are being executed and maybe the memory locations that are being accessed, but doesn't learn any of the data that is being operated over. What this implies is that if any software program satisfies memory trace obliviousness, then it should be secure. And Elaine will talk about that after this, so I won't elaborate, but that's a useful pointer, I think. You'll notice that I haven't spoken about the TTEE attacks that people usually talk about, like Spectre, Meltdown, all these kinds of attacks that rely on there being adversarial software running on the same hardware as the program we're trying to protect. And the reason I haven't spoken about this is partly because if we can secure against a physical attacker, we've secured against these as well, but also because these kinds of attacks are partly or largely often a threat because of the design decisions made in the hardware, not because of the inherent requirements of the use cases. We often don't have to run adversarial or unknown code next to the open, trusted code or audited code that we're running on hardware. So at this point, you might be saying, so what? I'm a cryptographer. I'm a long-term thinker. In 10 years' time, our cryptography will be way more performant. Why would I care about this new field of hardware that hasn't really given us any great results yet? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons that you should care, even if we think in the 10-year time horizon and we think, okay, snarks have gotten way more efficient, MPC, FHE, whatever, have become way more efficient. One is that I think performance is still going to be important. And one way to see this is an important differentiator between the technologies. And one way to see this is that MPC requires that a physical adversary doesn't have access to all of the parties, meaning they have to be separated in space. And this requires communication overhead, which will still be present even if we minimize computational overhead. And I think because a lot of the digital interactions on the internet are becoming more automated, not involving humans, the latency differences that we can tolerate or that will be important are becoming smaller and smaller. Second is that TTEs have unique trust assumptions. Maybe not even better trust assumptions, maybe worse trust assumptions, but they're different. And you can see this today where deployed MPC protocols like threshold signing products already require that the parties in the MPC run in TTEs to minimize collusion risk, an undetectable threat that is very real and makes setting up MPCs very, very complicated. Finally, we have governance over physical objects. Already today, we have cameras that journalists use to sign photos to attest that this is actually a photo taken in somewhere in the Middle East. It's not generated with an AI model somewhere in the US, for example. We may also want to test that surveillance cameras are not sending data off somewhere. It's all being processed locally. And you can make all sorts of very interesting examples with autonomous vehicles, with robotics. The point being that I think secure hardware is a required component in giving us assurances in these systems. The bottom line is that TTEs are here to stay. And for some of you, this might be horrifying. The hardware world hasn't provided us the kind of primitives that we're looking for before, and really hasn't even embodied the ideals that we want before. It's a space where everything is closed, and there's a lot of trusted relationships and large organizations that dominate. However, I think that there are important changes that have happened. There have been important changes happening in the hardware world that should give us cause for hope. The one is that there have been research breakthroughs that have allowed us to, or the hardware community, to apply rigorous security models, those that should be familiar to people in this audience, to hardware security reasoning. And at the same time, we've had a lot of advances in the open hardware ecosystem. And the combination of these two advances gives us hope because the same feedback cycle that have allowed us to significantly improve security and reach the point we're at today in other domains of security can be applied to the hardware world, where researchers, based off minimal assumptions, do a security proof which we implement in practice. This is then tested through open verifiable means, and again, we can go through the cycle iterating towards secure assumptions and implementations of these abstract schemes. To give you an idea, I thought I'd just put a chart that looks way more convincing. This is a couple years outdated, but there's just been many more chips being produced for which the actual physical design, the picture, the layout is publicly available. At the same time, there are a number of projects I listed two here doing open silicon where the design is at least partly open, targeting specifically secure use cases. These aren't there yet, but these aren't satisfying our use cases yet, but they are paving the way and providing a lot of reusable blocks that will be useful down the road. So on the research front, we have several problems that we have to tackle, and I'm going to flip through some solutions to these problems, not because I'm giving an exhaustive list, but just to give you almost like an existence proof that, hey, there's at least one idea that we can use to tackle these problems, but there are many more that I won't be mentioning. So first, we can divide our problem space into sort of physical attacks and supply chain attacks. Those that can be carried out on the hardware once it has been complete, and those that can be carried out by actors who tell us that they've designed the hardware in a certain way or manufactured the hardware in a certain way. On the physical side of things, we can divide into non-invasive and invasive attacks. Non-invasive attacks are those in which the structure of the chip hasn't changed. And this allows us to make some assumptions about what the adversary can see or do. Then invasive attacks are those in which the adversary does change the structure of the die or the chip. They drill into it, they shave away at it. And then on the supply chain side of things, we have two problems. One is, given access to a physical piece of hardware, can I tell that it does match an advertised design? And then the second is, how do we convince a remote user who doesn't have access to the physical design that some public key is associated, or some key pair is associated with a piece of hardware, and they can interact with this key and then only interact with the rules set out by the design of the hardware? So how do we bootstrap a protocol to leverage this inspection to give remote confidence? So one technology that's interesting, and actually one of the most interesting technologies to look at here, is PUFs, physical unclonable functions. And the high-level description here, I think the analogy is a physical hash function, is that there is natural variation in the ways in which we produce physical objects. No matter how hard we try, we can't exactly replicate the same object, and this is a problem that the hardware world has been trying to solve for a long time. And through the use of clever structures, we can amplify these variations to create a secret assigned to every physical object. Make it so sensitive that every chip, even though they satisfy the same design, has a different secret in it, and make it so sensitive that if someone does penetrate the die, shave away at it, the secret is destroyed. The hash function produces a different hash. And this is interesting because it helps us to avoid the manufacturing process requiring the manufacturer to generate keys and then inject them into the hardware, which is obviously a big security concern. It also helps us to protect against physical attackers because changing the physical structure of the die should change the secret, the key. And here's just an illustration of the kind of idea we want. We want a high probability of bits flipping in puffs when an adversary alters the structure of a die, of a chip. Die equals chip for this talk. And so that satisfies the invasive and inspection problems that I was talking about. Another interesting technology is Iris, which is an inspection methodology, like a visual or optical inspection technology. There are already technologies that allow us to, with very high confidence, tell exactly what a chip's design is, but these are destructive and expensive. This technology is interesting because they are trying to reach a point at which we do not need to destroy chips and we can quickly and cheaply audit them to know what their design is. complementary to this kind of technology, there's lots of research going into how we can design chips so that if there is a Trojan, if there is a backdoor inserted, it is obvious through a kind of technology like Iris. That's another technology satisfying inspection. Now, talking about the protocol that I mentioned we needed, you can imagine some world in which we have a magical 100% accurate inspection protocol where, given physical access, we know for sure what design has been implemented. In this world, a trivial protocol would be one in which we have N inspectors, each of them inspects the device and publicly attests to the device being correct and being associated with a certain key. In that world, a remote user only needs to trust one of these verifiers to have confidence that they're interacting with the chip they expect. Now, this isn't realistic. Inspection isn't perfect. And we can come up with some more like cryptoeconomic arguments around this as well. But this should give you a flavor. And I put a QR code there if you want to understand the problem a bit better. So that covers the protocol. Right. So the last thing I haven't mentioned is non-invasive attacks. And this is actually probably the most interesting class of attacks for this audience, partly because it's quite complicated to deal with these. Dealing with non-invasive attacks involves changing the way in which we do computation. And this necessitates taking performance trade-offs and navigating these well. And the style of reasoning that has been applied to dealing with these attacks is very similar to those that the cryptographers in the audience should be familiar with. So at a high level, just like in other forms of cryptography, we find some asymmetric advantage for the defender. In this case, the defender pays a polynomial or even a quadratic overhead in latency or surface area in the chip, which means that the attacker has to pay an exponential cost in the bandwidth of the side channel, the amount of information they can extract per second. And this is about, here I'm talking about side channels, but you have a similar argument for fault injection in which the precision required is amplified. So masking is a technology that you can think of at a high level as like MPC on a chip. It splits a computation into multiple shares. And this is used to mitigate side channels, to require the adversary to take longer and longer time observing the chip before they can extract any information. If we can make the amount of time sufficiently long, then we've reached a high level of security. Now, masking has a very interesting history, which I won't go through today. The point I'm just trying to make is that after more than 20 years of working on this kind of problem, a very interesting, a very important contribution was made, and that is of arbitrary composability. Before this point, protecting a circuit against side channel attacks using techniques like masking was very cumbersome. It required many hours of labor from highly skilled cryptographers and security researchers. And even then, they would still make mistakes. Now, with arbitrary composability, we need only do this laborious effort for a set of small gadgets, which can then be arbitrarily composed. This means that security can be very easily scaled to much more complex circuits and the processes that we ultimately are after. And unsurprisingly, immediately afterwards, or the year afterwards, the first automated tools for generating secure circuits, secure in this physical sense, was published. And many more have followed since. The problem now is no longer finding some notion of security that makes sense. It's optimizing these and making them performant and useful. One thing I want to say to this audience also is that this is a field of research that should be very appealing because it has a very strong connection, a mathematical connection, with the cryptographic foundations we rely on as well. Leakage resilient cryptography, this field of research falls within leakage resilient cryptography, and there's a strong chain of reductions that traces from the abstractions that we know as well down to security models that are very close to practical security, and a lot of work has gone to map between what is actually physically secure and what a threat model tells us. A mathematically abstract threat model. That slide was wrong. So to recap, I've said that TEEs are increasingly important and that we can't get away from that no matter how, not no matter how, like maybe we have quantum cryptography or something like that, but probably it's going to be a very important technology for the next 10 years, if not many more. I've also said that there's a lot of problems with the technology right now and said that we actually can do something about it. One challenge, though, is that us in the software community don't always feel empowered to make changes in this hardware world. It's a foreign world. It requires a different skill set. But actually, we can do something. There is a long history, if you look at how hardware was developed of there being a conversation between the hardware and software worlds. Hardware designers ultimately want to target applications just the same way that designing cryptographic protocols try to target applications. And for them to do that, they need to understand what the use cases are and where the demand is. At the same time, we need to use the hardware and develop software that optimizes for the hardware constraints. So what we can do at the moment, apart from actively investing in the hardware world and trying to make changes there, is give our part of the conversation. I'll give some examples of how I think we've done this well in the research world. One example is this trusted incrementer paper, which uses non-equivocation properties of secure hardware to implement a fast consensus mechanism. And what this paper does well is that they rely on minimal functionality. They don't assume that we have some abstract processor that is secure for all computations. They narrow down the specific functionality that we need, which makes it much easier for a hardware designer to say, oh, okay, this is the thing that I'm trying to secure. Let's optimize for this. Let's try to meet the performance requirements within the level of security we need. Another example is a ZipNet paper, which will be discussed later today. This is an anonymous broadcast design. And what's interesting about it is that it uses TEEs for efficiency, but it does it in a clever way. It's not simply relying on the TEE as being a trusted third party. Instead, it has this layered approach where the physical security only gives us liveness, and if there's a break in the TEE, that is immediately detectable because the protocol goes down, but we still preserve confidentiality as long as the cryptography works. A final example, and this is maybe the hardest one, is Raccoon, which is a signature scheme that is designed to be efficiently maskable, efficiently protected in a physical sense. And I think this is something we should look to because designing our protocols and our workloads to be physically secure makes it much more likely that we can navigate this sort of efficiency security trade-offs that the hardware design must if we are to meet this sort of trustless TE ideal, or at least move closer to it. To end, I think I'd like to go back to the definition of a cypherpunk. And I've highlighted here that a cypherpunk is someone who not only leverages security and privacy technology, but it is someone who tries to do this to effect change in the world. And sometimes when I speak to people about secure hardware, they are reticent because they prefer the abstraction and the mathematics that we see underlying software cryptography, which is much more familiar. And I firstly reject that because I think we can apply the same level of rigor to hardware. But also, even if that wasn't the case, really, if we look at what's happening in the world, hardware security is what's providing the kind of guarantees we would like to provide to more people than a lot of the other cryptography we're working on. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work on it, but it also means that we can't ignore hardware security. And really, I think it's a mistake of this community not doing so. So I've been working on an initiative for the last year, the Trustless TE initiative, along with some other people, that is targeting actually realizing a more secure, in the senses that I mentioned here, TEE in the next 3 years, and advancing the required research. If you want to learn more, you can scan this QR code. And I added a picture I won't explain here, just to remind you that hardware is also beautiful. Thank you.
right, thank you very much, Quintus. Do we have any questions? I think I can start us off. From your experience now interacting with hardware manufacturer, in addition to cryptographers and researchers, has anything surprised you? Like, how does hardware manufacture work in ways that may diverge from what we expect?
I think that probably the most surprising has been that security through obscurity is a relatively common, or like the de facto perspective in the hardware world. I think to this crowd, it's obvious that like having something open and auditable is the only way to really give high confidence that it is secure. And in that world, people just haven't come to see it that way. I don't think that's because that's actually how you achieve security, but it's because the sort of business and commercial needs have led everything to being closed source, and people have been using it as a crutch. And so I think just getting away from that already moves us quite far in the right direction.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
In May, I had breakfast with the new CEO of Intel, and there's a lot of cool stuff. And what are you doing with Intel? You've mentioned them a couple times.
We haven't spoken to Intel about the hardware specifically. I think.
So what's your background? Because you can talk to me afterwards, because I have this group that's working on this encryption stuff, and you might fit in because Intel's making it possible to integrate this kind of work into their chips. Yeah, and so I was just wondering what you were trying to do with Intel.
Yeah, I should have introduced myself as a junior software engineer. Like I'm not a hardware guy. I'm sort of a coordinator between the hardware people and us with the use cases. I think having not really spoken to Intel about this in depth, about more like software level things, I think one challenge for these large companies is they invest tremendous amounts into their chips, and so have to target a very large user base. And right now, the people who need GDPR tick boxes is a much larger group than the people who actually care about security. And I think that can change over time, but first we need to demonstrate that to them. And so right now, their like closed source security model, or closed source business model, is probably more likely to be appealing to them, and security trade-offs is likely to be unappealing. In the long run, I think that'll change, but that seems like an uphill battle in the short run.
Well, we should talk. There's two other groups that I'm working with, and I think you might be able to fit into the puzzle. And there's also a big announcement potentially at DevCon, a zero knowledge proof that if it actually stands up to scrutiny, will revolutionize encryption. So I want to include you in that circle.
That sounds amazing. Okay. That's not a question, but I love it.
Did any other of you working on this? I used to teach it. So I used to teach at Berkeley. I taught the entrepreneurship for engineers, even though I'm a mathematician. And we used to show up startups like in Soda Hall, like Databricks and things like that. And what the idea is to basically integrate all the technologies that are evolving. And Intel started out of here. Andy Grove and Gordon Moore both were graduated from Berkeley. And the idea is to put this future technology and put these groups together. And if you have anything like this, my email is really easy to remember. It's just berkeley@gmail.com. Okay.
Strong. Behind you, Sarah.
All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question about, so you've been interfacing with hardware people, trying to figure out, I don't know, which direction they're heading. What incentives do they have to sort of like take the knowledge that they've built they've accumulated a lot of knowledge building secure enclaves and so on and so forth, and probably all of those knowledge is inside NDAs at the moment. What incentives do these people have to sort of like, push this forward with us without NDAs, or like, I don't know, or we start from scratch, but like that's a long road.
So I will say that we aren't starting from scratch, and that there have been efforts already to move the open hardware ecosystem forward. I think the incentives, you can think of different incentive models. Probably the one that seems the most likely to be appealing to me now is that you can look at a project like Calyptra, which is a root of trust that the cloud manufacturers are all investing in. And the reason they're investing in this is because it's like too much effort for them all to do duplicate work, and then rather just have it be secure and be a standard that they all rely on. It's basically economically more efficient to invest in like a shared open source repo that they can all rely on than doing duplicate things with different standards that might be less secure. Also, more broadly, there is an increasing persuasion that openness is important for security, hence the project that I was mentioning. So obfuscation gives you security, gives the big guy security against the little guy. Like, it takes 9 months to reverse engineer it. That's actually decreasing, but in the extreme, it takes 9 months to reverse engineer what a chip is, and then they might sue you for publishing the results. But it doesn't prevent the other government from reverse engineering the chip, and so the small guy still has no protection against the big guy. And as more IP moves into these chips, and like Tesla's model weights are moved into their cars, I think they have more reason to invest in this kind of security. And we should not rely on obscurity because we're the little guy trying to be protected against the big guy. It shouldn't be big guys protected against the little guys. Yeah. I don't know if we have time, but there's another question.
When we ask about the standards, are standards things are right?
These standards are more at the interface level. It's not about the level of security. It's more about just the. No, it's like attestation standards. Yeah.